Actually, Anna Hyatt Huntington wasn't into promoting women sculptors. She was into promoting quality sculpture, period. Didn't matter whether it was by a man or a woman. And at the very end of this talk, I'll tell you what the end result was of that quality in sculpture. So women sculptors in the Brookgreen collection, and this is by no means all of them. We'd be here for a couple of days. And of course we're going to start with the man. One of the early champions of women sculptors in America was Illinois' native son, Lorado Taft, who made Chicago a focus for sculpture in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. He was among the first in this country to evolve a monumental style for his sculpture, which meant a departure from the detailed treatment of form toward the direction of broader masses and indefinite outlines. His interest in the history of art resulted in 2 books. I didn't think you wanted to see books, so I'm putting his sculpture up. The first comprehensive survey of American sculpture, published in 1903 and revised and enlarged in 1930, and Modern Tendencies in Sculpture, from lectures delivered at the Art Institute of Chicago in 1917. It is interesting to note that several of the sculptors in Brookgreen's collection are included in Taft's chapter on significant American sculpture created since 1900. Mentioned were the names of male sculptors: St. Gaudens, McMonnies, McCartin, French, Bartlett, Fraser, Barnard, McNeil, Calder, Gravely, Millis, Borglum, Manship, and Weinman, plus 3 women: Anna Hyatt, Evelyn Longman, and Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. One of Lorado Taft's major contributions during the preparations for the World's Columbian Exposition in 1893 was an unplanned one. The work was far behind schedule, and Taft was desperate to hire competent sculptors to help in completing the assignments. In an often quoted conversation with Daniel Burnham, the exposition's chief architect, Burnham was reported to have replied to Taft's request for permission to hire women: "Hire anyone who can do the work. White rabbits if they will help out." The women he hired became known as the White Rabbits, and from their ranks emerged some of the most talented and successful women sculptors of the next generation. They included Bessie Pottervana, Julia Bracken, Enid Yandell, Carol Brooks, Helen Farnsworth Mears, Margaret Giroux, Mary Lawrence, and Janet Scudder, all of whom went on to important individual careers as sculptors. The White Rabbits of the Chicago World's Fair and other women sculptors did not achieve important careers, however, without surmounting significant obstacles, including prejudice, sexism, and discrimination. They accomplished this frequently while juggling the societal demands of being wives, mothers, and caregivers to members of the extended family. Some of them never married, believing the burdens of marriage exacted too great a toll upon their careers and diverted too much away from the focus required to create sculpture. All of them achieved their results through willpower and perseverance. One of the White Rabbits, Janet Scudder, was greatly impressed by the exuberant sculpture of Frederick McMonnies she saw each day at the fair. Setting out for Paris after the World's Fair closed, Scudder was determined that she would study with him. After several visits to his studio and a great deal of badgering, she eventually persuaded McMonnies to accept her as an assistant. On a trip to Italy, she saw for the first time the Renaissance sculpture of Donatello and Verrocchio that became a pivotal influence in her work. Her first sculpture produced in this period, Frog Baby, was one of the works purchased by the architect Stanford White for use in the elaborate homes he designed for his clients. With this patronage, Scudder's career was firmly established, and her work was bought up as quickly as she could produce it. Although she was considered the major creator of garden sculpture in America at the time, such as this sculpture, there it is, tortoise fountain. She did have several commissions for medals. In fact, she was the first woman whose medals were purchased by the French government for display at the Luxembourg Museum at Paris. Her medals owe their distinctiveness not to Frederick McMonnies, but to his teacher, Augustus St. Gaudens. Also significant is the relationship that both artists had with Stanford White. Common to Scudder and St. Gaudens was a mastery of low relief and the modeling of self-frames in many of the works. Her portraits of Arthur Middleton Reeves and his daughter, Caroline Reeves Folk, reveal her affinity for presenting the character of the sitter. Brenda Putnam began to create a series of Mary Children and fountains and sundials, such as this one on the right at Brookgreen. This was about the time she shared a studio with Anna Hyatt on 12th Street in New York City. Like Janet Scudder and Frances Grimes, she made a name for herself with engaging portrait reliefs of children that were commissioned by eager parents. And later in her career, her style changed to more plain and somber presentations that evoke dignity without sacrificing the tenderness found in her earlier work. An example of this period is Communion, dating from 1949. For the Panama Pacific Exposition in San Francisco in 1915, more than 1,500 sculptures were commissioned from artists all over the world, placed on arches and columns, in niches, in fountains, and in freestanding groups. They sing in many themes, always in harmony, but with no loss of character or individuality, proclaimed the exposition's acting chief of sculpture, Alexander Stirling Calder. His imagination and sense of design, with the help of a number of able sculptors, made its sculpture the richest and most unified of any of the expositions. A magic arose from the commonplace and artful details of the fair, as much from the monuments. We saw shining, almost imaginary buildings full of unbelievable works of sculpture, painting, weaving, basket making, products of agriculture, and all kinds of mechanical inventions. Author William Saroyan wrote of his childhood visit to the fair. It was, he thought, a place that couldn't possibly be real. A crowd favorite among the art on view was Duck Baby, a fountain sculpture by Edith Parsons. Introduced to an admiring audience, Duck Baby became the poster child for the fair. It was even featured in a poem, shown here by Leo Robinson, about the last night of the fair, titled When the Lights Went Out. At the age of 6, Edith Parsons moved with her family from Virginia to New Jersey. She said that the move inspired her to become an artist. The Virginia property had been so beautiful, and she found the structured garden in New Jersey so ugly that she decided to create work that celebrated the beauty of untouched nature. According to Parsons' granddaughter, her figures are pure in their natural state, with no added man-made ornamentation or sentimentality. In her best-known figures of small children and animals, we can detect a subtle connection between the animals and the children. Duck Baby's hair, for example, flies out at the side, resembling little wings. There is that hint at connection to be found in each of them. Parsons studied from the age of 15 at the Art Students League in New York City with Daniel Chester French and George Gray Bernard, and she worked as an apprentice to James Earle Fraser. In 1903, at the age of 25, she was appointed to design the pediment of the main entrance to the Liberal Arts Building at the St. Louis Fair. Parsons' best-known works are the garden sculptures she made between 1911 and 1930. Duck Baby, Turtle Baby, Frog Baby, Joy Fountain, Little Duck Fountain, Big Duck, and Baby Pan. Quoting an anonymous newspaper article about Parsons from the 1920s, though intensely reticent about herself, one may, if privileged to enter that home, breathe there the spirit of the gifted woman who has been able to imprison in bronze the smile of a little child. The only woman admitted as an assistant in Daniel Chester French's studio was Evelyn Beatrice Longman. After 3 years, she opened her own studio, but retained her connection with French, a relationship that grew into a lifelong friendship. She collaborated with him in the commission of the Lincoln Memorial, for which she created the ornamental frieze along the top of the building. Her professional debut as a sculptor was with Victory, on the left, designed for the dome of Festival Hall at the St. Louis Exposition of 1904. Following this success was a commission for the Ceres Fountain in the Court of the Four Seasons at the Panama Pacific Exposition in San Francisco in 1915. But she is best known for the sculpture atop the original AT&T corporate headquarters in New York City, although its title was Spirit of Communication. It became known as Golden Boy, for obvious reasons. And at 24 feet tall was New York's second largest sculpture after the Statue of Liberty. A few months after Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney's death at the age of 67, the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York City held a memorial exhibition of 65 of her works spanning her career. Her friend and the museum director, Juliana Force, wrote the introduction to the catalog, and in keeping with the wishes of Gertrude, confined it to, in her words, the salient facts of her life as they concerned her work as an artist. She wrote, "I feel bound by the memory of her reticence to refrain from touching upon the more intimate side of her life. The beauty that she brought to her personal relationships was best known to her family and to her closest friends. But even upon the most casual acquaintanceship, there was revealed the gentleness and warmth of a nature that lay behind the reserve and natural dignity of her manner." She was born in New York City in 1875, the daughter of Cornelius Vanderbilt, whose great-grandfather, Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt, amassed one of the country's great personal fortunes, and whose grandfather, William Vanderbilt, doubled that fortune. Gertrude struggled for years against what fellow artist and friend Guy Penet Dubois called the wall of money to become a respected sculptor. Sometime after her marriage to Harry Payne Whitney, Gertrude started on a career, studying first with Hendrik Anderson and James Earle Fraser. Later, she attended the Art Students League and, going to Paris, worked under the instruction of Andrew O'Connor, who had been an assistant to William Ordray Partridge and Daniel Chester French. During this period, possibly through O'Connor's good graces, her work attracted the interest of Rodin, who gave her private criticism, but not formal instruction. A shift toward more expression and passion began to appear in her work. In 1907, she converted a stable at 19 McDougal Alley into a studio. Aside from a few commissions for monuments, her best works were rarely exhibited. They depicted soldiers on the front lines in France during World War I, where Whitney had established a field hospital and saw firsthand the effects of technology and trench warfare that made soldiers especially susceptible to disfiguring facial injuries and shattered limbs, the effects of being gassed, and what we refer to today as post-traumatic stress syndrome, brought on by the horrors of war. The small sculptures that she produced of those soldiers in battle and at rest are among her best works. Anna Coleman Lad had relatives in San Diego and worked there seasonally from 1936 to 1938. A nationally known sculptor from Massachusetts, Lad had executed busts of many famous people, including ballerina Anna Pavlova and actor Ethel Barrymore. During World War I, she organized the American Red Cross Studio to make portrait masks for disfigured soldiers. She became a pioneer in plastic surgery, learning the art of skin grafting and creating masks to cover soldiers' wounds and scars. As I said earlier, marriage was a formidable obstacle to a woman's career, even when the spouse was an artist. Elsie Ward gave every indication that she could become a great sculptor, but devoted some of her most productive years to assisting her husband, Henry Herring with his art. Born in Missouri in 1872, she was brought to Denver by her family in 1887. After beginning her training with local artists, Herring went to New York to attend the Art Students League in 1896. Her teachers, Augustus St. Gaudens and Daniel Chester French, encouraged her to go to Paris. 2 years later, she established a studio there and modeled Boy and Frog, which won a bronze medal at the 1904 Louisiana Purchase Exposition in St. Louis. In 1900, St. Gaudens had invited her to work in his studio at Cornish, New Hampshire. For the next 10 years, she assisted him with many of his most important commissions. Along with Francis Grimes, another talented studio assistant, Ward finished some of St. Gaudens' projects underway at the time of his death. However, after her 1910 marriage to Henry Herring, another assistant in St. Gaudens' studio, she helped her husband become a successful sculptor and produce little work of her own. Chicago native Laura Gardner studied with James Earle Fraser at the Art Students League in New York between 1907 and 1910. She won the St. Gaudens Medal in her first year, a scholarship in her second year, and in her last term, the St. Gaudens Figure Prize. She married James Earle Fraser in 1913. Fraser's career as a sculptor began with her creations of animals, fountains, medals, and coins. With her design of the Alabama Centennial commemorative $50 struck in 1921, she became the first woman to design a coin for the United States Treasury. And she designed the Oklahoma Semi-Centennial Medal in 1957. She was commissioned to do several monuments, including the heroic double equestrian statue of Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson in Wyman Park in Baltimore. At least I think it's still there. And the Elks Memorial in Chicago. I know this was one that was looked at for being removed lately. Much honored in 1912, Laura Gardner Fraser was elected to the National Sculpture Society, and in 1915 won the National Arts Club Medal of Honor. She was a winner of the Saltus Gold Medal from the National Academy in 1924 and 1927, and she was the first woman to win the Saltus Medal of the American Numismatic Society in 1926, the highest award for the art of the medal in the United States. The Watrous Gold Medal was awarded to her from the National Academy in 1931. Although she had several important commissions and a distinguished career in her own right, some always linked her success to her husband. She wrote, "Jimmy and I had standing jokes between us. One of them was when I finished a job and it was presented, we would wager as to how long it would be before someone would comment to me that Mr. Fraser helped you on this one." One time in fun, I snapped back at a wealthy patron, "Just who is this James Earle Fraser I keep hearing about?" Her sculpture, Baby Goat, won the Julia Shaw Memorial Prize of the National Academy of Design in 1919. The one commission they did work together on was the Oregon Trail Memorial $50. Although she created the Oklahoma Run, a 22-foot-long relief by herself, the commission fell through. The plaster is now at the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum in Oklahoma City. The Frasers, plaster models, and personal effects are also there in their archives. Sally James was born into a wealthy family and married George Paulding Farnham, an internationally known designer for Tiffany & Company in New York. After her beloved father died in 1901, she suffered a breakdown, requiring a period of prolonged bed rest. Her husband gave her modeling clay, hoping to alleviate her depression and boredom, and she began to make small figures. Her friends and neighbors, Frederick Remington and Henry Schrady, encouraged her to pursue sculpture. Remington referring to one of her early works as ugly as sin, yet full of ginger. She plunged into sculpture, creating a cave woman on the left as a pendant to Remington's cave man on the right. Progressing as a self-taught sculptor, she produced portraits, war memorials, and allegorical figures. One of her best-known works was The End of the Day, commissioned in 1922 by ballroom dancer Irene Castle for the grave of her husband and dance partner Vernon Castle, who died in World War I. Eventually, Farnham modeled a series of Western-themed pieces as a tribute to her mentor, Remington. Horse and Rider is now at the Remington Museum, and Payday is in the collection of the Wool Rock Museum in Oklahoma. Her memorial to Will Rogers was done in 1936, her last major work. Archer Huntington, founder of the Hispanic Society in New York City and husband of sculptor Anna Hyatt Huntington, knew the architect William Temple Johnson and developed an interest in San Diego's art museum designed by Johnson. This resulted in the gift of El Cid Campeador, one of the best-known public sculptures in San Diego. Created by Anna Huntington, the first bronze casting of the larger-than-life-size equestrian sculpture was presented to the city of Seville, Spain in 1927. The Huntingtons produced 2 additional casts, one for the courtyard of the Hispanic Society headquarters in New York City, and the other presented to San Diego after having been exhibited at the Contemporary American Sculpture Show in San Francisco. Dedicated on July 5, 1930, it stands on a high limestone base designed by Johnson in the Plaza de Panama in Balboa Park. Later casts were also made for San Francisco and Buenos Aires, Argentina. 3 more of Mrs. Huntington's works were presented to San Diego's museum by the couple, and 2 of these, small versions of Youth Taming the Wild and Young Diana, once flanked the entrance to the San Diego Museum of Arts. Youth Taming the Wild and another sculpture by her in memory of the workhorse present man and horse in a struggle, each group having its own purpose and message. While Youth Taming the Wild depicts man attempting to control the horse, Workhorse presents the pair struggling as one against the elements rather than against one another. Initially designed in 1914 as a pair for gateposts, Youth Taming the Wild was modeled in 1927 as a monument to Huntington's father-in-law, Collis Potter Huntington, a 19th century railroad entrepreneur and self-made man. At his death in 1900, Huntington owned the Southern Pacific, Central Pacific, and Chesapeake and Ohio railroads, and the Newport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company. With a tough character and no-nonsense attitude, he epitomized the men who carved out vast empires in 19th century America. The imagery of a strapping young man trying to control a wild stallion related not only to Collis Huntington as a person, but to the idea of man taming the wild western frontier. In Anna Hyatt Huntington's work, the young man holds onto a rope halter as he pushes into the horse, trying to subdue it while maintaining his footing. Both figures show signs of exertion with taut muscles and bulging veins. Huntington has posed virile man against equally virile horse in an S-shaped design emphasizing upward movement. A device she often used in her work, the spiral draws the viewer's eye up through the composition to the top of the sculpture, in this case, the horse's head. There is a sense of danger portrayed in Youth Taming the Wild. Dynamic action seen in rearing horses and gesturing figures were often featured in Huntington's work, yet she excelled in placing her subjects in poses that were authentic without becoming hackneyed or sentimental. Anna Hyatt Huntington's fascination with horses and her penchant for posing them in windy settings developed early and recurred throughout her life. Winter Noon, Uphill and Downhill, The Steep Grade, and Colts in a Storm, each created between 1903 and 1916, depicted horses huddling into or struggling against wind. In her childhood and as a young woman, Huntington observed and often worked with the large draft horses used for plowing and hauling hay in the vicinity of her family home at Annisquam, Massachusetts. In Memory of the Workhorse, dated 1964, depicts a farmer leading a workhorse on an uphill grade. Both figures lean into the wind, heads down, struggling to walk, while the wind blasts clothing, mane, and tail. With one hand, the farmer hangs onto a harness around the horse's neck, and with the other clutches his coat to his chest. Huntington leaves it to the viewer to decide whether the pair have completed their workday and are heading for the barn, or whether a storm has interrupted their daily routine. The composition is structured on a diagonal line, enhancing the feeling of movement, emphasized by the incline of the base. In contrast to Youth Taming the Wild, where the figures struggle against one another, literally pushing into one another, the workhorse figures are united as one and move in the same direction. They labor together in a common goal, struggling against the unseen. The team of farmer and horse, together carving out a living from the earth, represents a piece of Americana. Created when she was 88 years old, the sculpture is a good example of Huntington's lifelong examination of the relationship between horse and man. Allie Victoria Tennant was born in St. Louis, Missouri. At an early age, she moved with her family to Dallas, where she made her first sculpture at age 8 and received her earliest art training. In the late 1920s, she went to New York and studied anatomy under George Bridgman and sculpture with Edward McCartin at the Art Students League. After her return to Dallas, Allie Tennant became a member of a regionalist group of artists active there during the 1930s. She made portrait busts, full-figure commemorative works, fountain pieces, and architectural sculpture. Tennant favored cast bronze, but also worked with marble and sandstone. On this female head, she experimented with direct carving. The most high-profile work of Tennant's is the 9-foot-high gilded bronze Tejas Warrior, placed in 1936 over the entrance doorway of the Texas Centennial Hall of State in Dallas. The warrior's smoothly modeled contours shown on the right in a smaller version. Excuse me, not on the right. I took it out. The smaller version is in our collection. You can see it in the Brown Sculpture Court. Anyhow, they reflect the Art Deco influence. She also created the plaster relief cattle, oil, and wheat for the U.S. Post Office and Electra, funded by the WPA. In addition, she completed a number of portrait busts and garden sculptures for schools, private institutions, and individual patrons. From the late 1920s to the early 40s, Tennant exhibited her work extensively, winning regional prizes and national recognition. She was elected a Fellow of the National Sculpture Society in 1934, and in 1943, Tennant and other sculptors founded the Texas Sculptors Group, and she served as its first president. In 1911, after studying with James Earle Fraser in New York, Eugenia Nard went to Paris and had criticisms from Bourdelle and Rodin. Eventually, she began to model animals, adopting simplified contours to emphasize the ascendant combination is possible due to my chosen artistic style that ranks between abstraction and realism. Colorado artist Beryl Goodnight's interpretations of historic scenes and folklore from the American West often focus on women and their work. An early sculpture, Cares for Her Brothers, depicted a Cheyenne tale about Iwo Humishi Himi, a woman who cared for all living things. The deprivation and danger of life in a wagon train are poignantly explored in No Turning Back and Passing Times. Her pair of female riders from different eras juxtaposes the past and the present in the sculptural time warp, while No Turning Back reveals some of the perils of traveling the trail. Jane D. Decker's art also focuses on women, but more often specifically on their roles as mothers and caregivers, and her humorous yet true-to-life views of childhood, those remembered and yet to come, record scenes of children at play and at rest that are familiar to everyone. A busy mother of several children and a full-time sculptor, she unapologetically draws from the world around her for inspiration and subject matter. In 1992, Brookgreen Gardens, the first public sculpture garden in this country, was designated a National Historic Landmark due to the significance of its founder, Anna Hyatt Huntington, as an artist and patron of the arts, and to the number of women represented in the collection, making it an important site for women's history in America. The time of women working in sculpture spans nearly the entire timeline of American art history. It's important to recognize and celebrate their accomplishments, and perhaps to revise some of the standard art history reference books to give them more prominent exposure. Thank you.